Hello and welcome. If you came here to learn about Gemini Inscriptions and how to get better at Gunfire Reborn, you came to the right place. And if you came here to fix your relationship, well, as long as you brought your partner along, you also came to the right place. So let's go ahead and get started. So what are the Gemini Inscriptions in Gunfire Reborn? So Gemini Inscriptions are bonuses that are added on to your weapons. Any weapon can only have one Gemini Inscription at a time. The bonus effect from the Gemini Inscription is only active when both of your weapons have the same Gemini Inscription. How do I get these inscriptions, you may ask? Well, first off, in your talent tree, you have to unlock the Gemini Inscription, which you can get at level 30. And when you reach level 90, you can get the talent Legendary Craftsman, who can etch more inscriptions onto your weapons, including Gemini Inscriptions. In order for the Craftsman to etch Gemini Inscriptions onto your weapon must already have 4 inscriptions on it, or it must already be level 5. There are 5 possible Gemini Inscriptions a weapon could have, and I'll start with the most simple one in my opinion. This one would be Weapons 1 and 2 magazine capacity become the sum of both weapons' magazine capacity, and rate of fire 25%. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Whatever the maximum magazine capacity of your first weapon is, gets added on to that of the second, and vice versa. So if you have 2 weapons that have a magazine capacity of 20 and 30, then if you use this Gemini Inscription on them, they will both have a magazine capacity of 50. And the 25% extra rate of fire I think is really good. This Gemini Inscription shines its best on weapons that have really small magazine capacities. Shotguns, for example, work really well with this Gemini Inscription because they have a low magazine capacity and you spend a lot of time reloading. But with this Gemini Inscription, you cut off a lot of that reloading time and eventually get more damage in, especially with the rate of fire buff as well. If you're going to use this Gemini Inscription, I would suggest having one weapon that has a low magazine capacity that you're going to be focusing on using, and having another one with a high magazine capacity to maximize how much you're improving on that first weapon. This second Gemini Inscription is probably my favorite out of the 5. Weapon 1 and 2 share their elemental advantages, and there's a chance to apply the elemental effect from the other weapon. If you have 2 weapons that have the same elemental effect, like fire, then you have a greater chance of dealing the burn effect. However, this Gemini Inscription is far better when you have 2 weapons of different elemental advantages. Your weapons sharing their elemental advantage means that if you have a fire and a lightning weapon, both fire and lightning will do 150% damage to health and shield, but 75% damage to armor. This makes it so you have elemental advantage against most of the enemies that you're going to be going up against. In Gunfire Reborn, they call health flesh, so anytime I say health or flesh, those two mean the same thing. What I would suggest is to almost always have one of these 2 weapons be a weapon that has a fire effect. This is because every enemy has health. Not every enemy has shield, and not every enemy has armor. As for your second weapon, it kinda depends on the situation whether lightning or corrosion is better. But you'll always see shield enemies and some armor enemies in any of the worlds, so I think both are relatively viable. Now, one really important thing about this Gemini Inscription is what I believe makes it far better than what it seems like at the surface. In Gunfire Reborn, if you apply 2 different elemental effects to the same enemy, you can cause what is called a fusion effect. This Gemini Inscription allows you to very easily apply fusion effect onto enemies. Now, there are different types of fusion effects depending on what elements you use, corrosion, burning, or shock. And I think I'll go over that in another video because that's a whole topic in itself. So if you want to see that, make sure to leave a comment about it and subscribe just to let me know that you want to see that. The next Gemini Inscription is Weapon 1 and 2 share CritX bonus but minus 50% stability. A CritX bonus is a multiplier that increases the amount of damage you do to an enemy when you hit it in its weak spot, which for most enemies is the head. Now, obviously, this inscription simply does not show up on any weapons that cannot crit. When you do get this Gemini Inscription, the way it works is that each weapon's CritX multiplier is added together and then reduced by 2. So you can't just have 2 weapons with a 5x CritX bonus and have 10 times the crit damage. That would just be kind of insane, but it still makes a pretty good difference. But the -2 from the CritX bonus is really important to understanding which weapons this works best on. First off, for context, shotguns, injectors, and rifles have pretty bad crit multipliers. This Gemini simply just isn't as effective on these. However, submachine guns, pistols, and snipers have higher crit multipliers. So I think the best way to explain this is actually just to start by giving an example. So let's say you're using this Gemini inscription on an injector, like the laser gloves, and then your other weapon is the bloody drill, a sniper. The laser gloves has a CritX of 2, and the bloody drill has a CritX of 4. So to find out your crit bonus on these two weapons, first you add the 2 and the 4, and then you subtract another 2, which means both of these weapons will now have a CritX of 4. For the laser gloves, that's pretty good. You went from 2 to 4. It's doubling the CritX bonus. That's nice. For the sniper, however, the bloody drill, it doesn't benefit at all. It just stays at 4. In this example, the laser gloves, if you have them at a pretty high level with good inscriptions, maybe this could work well. However, this Gemini inscription works its best when you have two weapons that have like a relatively higher CritX bonus. Using a submachine gun, like a dual fang, which has a CritX of 3, and a sniper, like the piercing flame, which has a CritX of 4, gives you a larger CritX. First you add the 3 and the 4, which gives you 7, then you subtract 2, which is 5. So both of the weapons improve. Now, if you're just going to be focusing on one weapon itself, then it doesn't really matter if your other weapon doesn't receive any bonus from this. But I thought I might as well share the difference between those two examples where one weapon doesn't receive any bonus, just in case you run into that situation thinking it would. And as for the -50% stability, it isn't that big of a deal as long as you're able to correct for it, because all stability is in Gunfire is just recoil. So if you're using an SMG, that's when you'll feel it the most. However, if you just move your crosshair down while you're shooting, it'll compensate for it, which takes a bit of practice, but I don't think it's the biggest deal. And now for number 4. Plant a spore on the target when hitting enemy and create an explosion when the spore from different weapon meets each other. So like the inscription itself says, when you shoot an enemy with one of your weapons, it leaves a spore on that enemy. When you shoot them with your other weapon, it blows up that spore and it does damage. You can have up to 29 spores on an enemy at once. That explosion does the same damage as your first weapon does. And yes, this does take into account the CritX multiplier if you hit on a weak spot. However, this spore explosion damage does not receive the benefits from the weapon damage multipliers, from your skill damage multipliers, your elemental damage, or even your lucky shots. And this is the main reason why it just doesn't scale very well into the late game. It's one of the main reasons why I don't like it. But now if you do want to use this inscription, it might be best to use Albai, which is the dog character. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not entirely sure if I'm pronouncing that very well, but you get the point. And the reason for this is that Albai has an ability called Dual Wield, which allows him to draw out both of his weapons at the same time. He can shoot a couple times with one gun and then shoot a couple times with the next gun in order to proc the explosion effect. Any other character using this Gemini inscription has to swap between their weapons, which is just slowing you down. It's less time that you're shooting. Other than this situation, however, I don't think I would typically recommend going for this Gemini inscription. If you so happen to get it by chance, sure, it can still be better than no Gemini inscription, but I just think there's better options. Now before we get into this last Gemini inscription, if this video was any help to you or you just enjoyed watching, I would appreciate it if you left a like. It helps a bunch. Thanks. And so as for the last inscription, killing an enemy with the held weapon increases the base damage of the next shot from the offhand weapon by 50%. Honestly, this one is very similar to the Spore Gemini inscription, which doesn't say good things about this one. Instead of planting a spore after every shot, you get a bonus after every kill, which is typically less often. This damage boost is basically as if your secondary weapon was 3 levels higher for the next shot. And so now that you know how it works, let's go over the list of problems that I have with this one. So obviously, like the Spore Gemini, you have to constantly switch weapons in order to receive any of the benefits from this one. And remember, anytime you're reloading or swapping weapons or anything, it's decreasing the amount of time you're shooting, which just makes you deal less damage per second overall. The next problem with this is that this inscription only shows up on melee weapons, launchers, snipers, and shotguns. This means that the Gemini inscription is not even applicable on half of the cast of weapons. I can kind of see why they did this, because it's typically most effective on the weapons with a low rate of fire anyways, but still, you're not going to be using this very often. One problem that I feel that makes this Gemini inscription possibly even worse than the Spore Gemini is that the dog character, Aobai, he can't dual wield a lot of the weapons that this Gemini inscription applies to. For example, there are 3 melee weapons in this game, and he is not allowed to dual wield any of them. So you're never going to have this Gemini inscription on a melee weapon and ever be able to use it without switching weapons all the time. My last issue with this Gemini inscription is that it's typically useless in boss fights. All the boss fights have very few side enemies, if any at all. Most of the time, you are not going to be receiving any benefits from this Gemini inscription during a boss fight, which is debatably the most important time where you would need things like this. Now, if you still wanted to use this Gemini inscription even after hearing my opinion on it, I would suggest using weapons with low rate of fires like snipers or launchers. These kind of weapons give you the best bang for your buck for this Gemini inscription. If your sniper can one-shot a lot of the weak enemies in a stage, then you'll be getting that damage boost very often. But the thing is, you're not going to be seeing this very often on the harder difficulties, where this is typically where you want Geminis to work the best. Alright, I hope you guys learned a thing or two about Gemini inscriptions. I know that making this video, I learned some things too. And remember, just putting these to practice, figuring out what works best for you, that is probably one of the best ways to improve at Gunfire. And honestly, any game really. So if you enjoyed, remember to leave a like, and until next time, thank you, bye-bye.